Okay, we're here again, and here's the first of the episodes on the Bible Masterclass. Today's topic is talking about what is the Bible. This series is presented by Single Spoon Ministries, and your host today is Paul Chubb. So this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to discuss the key features of the Bible from a very high viewpoint. So in other words, we're going to try and get a broad overview of what the Bible is all about. Not so much the content, but how it's divided up, how it was made, and all those kind of things. So the key thing you need to take home, the key thing you need to understand today is the Bible has a very long viewpoint. Very long history. It has many contexts, many viewpoints, many writers, and many types of material. It is by understanding these different types of view that we begin to understand the text. So the first thing to understand is that the Bible is very much the product of a community. And that community is the covenant community of faith. By some estimates, it was written over a period of about 1200 years. So from about the time of David, 1000 BC, through to 2 Timothy, if you believe the late dating of 2 Timothy, around 200 AD. And the reason why it began around David's time is that up to that point there wasn't a gathering of people who were literate in one place. So before that it was oral tradition to the majority. Once you get to David, you have a court building up, you have prosperity beginning, you have people who are literate gathered together, and there was enough room to begin to write some of this stuff down and begin to write all the different things that they knew about God down. And of course, a large part of what they wrote down during that time were either stuff that was coming out of their interaction with God at the time, or stuff that they had inherited through oral tradition. Now, over a period of 1200 years, you can almost guarantee that there are going to be many different theologies, many different contexts, and many different writers. And one of the things that these people did that we don't tend to is that they tended to, instead of harmonizing the stuff they wrote, they simply used to bung it all together, even though it disagreed with each other. And out of that disagreement, out of that dichotomy, out of the different things placed side by side, they saw the God they were trying to express. We would have taken that stuff and looked at the genealogy of Luke and the genealogy of Matthew and said, well, these don't match up. They don't make any sense because it's a completely different line of people coming down to explain what the lineage of Jesus was. And we would have been in there with our family tree, and we would have taken out some people and put in others until we were satisfied that we had the one family tree, and that was with the family tree, the authoritative family tree that we would use right the way through. Instead, you have two sitting there in the Bible text, and it didn't really bother them. The second thing is that it was written for a specific purpose and a specific audience. While we like to think that today the Bible speaks to us and is written from God to us and all that stuff, originally it was written by someone sitting in a community, and he looked at what was happening in that community or in the immediate surrounds and heard from God and proceeded to write something to speak into that situation. It is the hand of God that we can now pick up that writing and take it and begin to apply it to our daily lives together, and see God speaking to us today. So the Bible can be seen as the library of books. We generally divide it into the Old Testament and the New Testament. Literally, this is an account of the Old Covenant and an account of the New Covenant. In other words, they're the witness statements of the people who lived out the Old and New Testament times. So how do we divide it up? There are many ways to divide it up, and I'm going to share with you a few and talk a little bit about some of the things it tells us about the Bible as we divide it up. Firstly, there is the Torah. The basis of the whole Judaic view of life is the Torah. It is the primary work in their canon even today, and it consists of the books of Genesis to Deuteronomy. Later, you had the prophets, and in their terminology, in their division, that included the Old Testament books as well. So things like Kings and Samuel and Chronicles. And that was like the second tier of their canon. The third tier was the writings. And some of the New Testament writings actually predate the canonization of the writings, although the writing of the writings, so the authorship of the writings, finished by about 200 BC. And the writings picks up all the rest of the Old Testament, so things like Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Job, and so on. In the New Testament, we tend to think of the Gospels, Acts, the Epistles, and finally Revelations. Another way that today scholars tend to divide up the Old and New Testament is the Pentateuch, so the first 5 books, Genesis to Deuteronomy. The Deuteronomic history, which they say is one work, and it goes from Deuteronomy through to the end of 2 Kings. Written in over several different attempts in just pre-exile, exile, and post-exile. So a triple redaction or triple editing. Then there's Chronicles, which is later, and it is 1 Chronicles through to Esther. You have the Psalms, which in their final form are the hymn book of the Second Temple. And finally, you have the wisdom books, things like Proverbs to Song of Solomon and Job. You have the prophets, which are Isaiah to Malachi. And the New Testament pretty much the same way. You could divide it up in terms of the type of things that you find in those books. So you have the law, so Genesis to Deuteronomy. You have historical works, Joshua through to Esther. You have wisdom works, pretty much Job through to Song of Solomon. You have the major prophets, Isaiah through to Dan, and then you have the minor prophets, also known, and this term comes from the Jews, the 12, Hosea to Malachi. In the New Testament, you could divide it up into the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And they come together because they're actually about trying to give you an overview of what happened in Jesus' life. And bring together all that material they actually share from each other, and so on. You could divide them up by who wrote them. And I don't necessarily mean that they were written by one person, but the communities who wrote them. So the Lucan stuff, Luke and Acts, and there was originally, or there was planned, a 3rd volume in the Lucan corpus. The Johannine corpus, you've got John, the Gospel of John, the epistles 1 to 3 John, and then Revelations. The Petrine work, 1 to 2 Peter. You've got the Pauline work, Romans and Philemon. And you've got the pastoral epistles in the Pauline corpus, 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, which were written specifically to people that Paul was mentoring and training up in the ministry. And finally, you've got a grab bag of other epistles that are generally known as the Hebraic epistles. You could divide it up in terms of types of text. So you've got legal theological. And it's important to realize that just about everything in the Bible is theological. It's all speaking something about God. That is its purpose. It's not about the legal, it's about the theological. But the theological couched in legal terms. You have the historical theological. Even the historical stuff about kings has a specific theological purpose in that it's meant to speak to the people that it was written to and by God's grace speak to us today. You have hymns, so the sacred songs of the people of the covenant community. And you even find some of the hymns of the early church in some of the epistles. You have wisdom literature, which talks about how to be wise and thus please God. You have epistles which are written from a church leader to churches generally, or to specific people. You have apocalyptic. And apocalyptic is vastly different to the prophetic. And we'll say more about that in a minute. And finally, you have the prophetic, whether New Testament or Old Testament. So if we talk about the Bible, we immediately come to a specific technique, a specific feature, a specific tool called the Sitz in Leben. Now, as of about 1890, there was a revolution in biblical study led by the Germans. A key figure at the time was a guy called Wellhausen. And for this reason, we have a number of Germanic terms which have come into the vocabulary of theologians. And this is one of them, the Sitz in Leben, literally the life setting of the text. There's an axiom: all biblical text is written to a specific sitz or life setting. As such, the audience is important, and this can be described as social criticism. So in other words, instead of having someone who sat on a mountain and thought, okay, I'm going to prophesy about the events in 2200, and proceeds to deliver his prophecy, and it gets written down and put in a bottle in the hope that someone in 2200 actually hears and knows it, finds it and hears it. It's specifically written to the people of the time. And so it's more like that person saying to them, okay, you've been bad, God's angry at you, he's going to send you into exile. You're going to be there for 100 years, and after 100 years, once you've repented, he's going to smile on you again and bring you back to the land. Although it's talking about future events, it's specifically talking to people who are in front of the prophet, who are in front of the writer, so to speak. So it is very important that we understand the life setting of the passage, because then we begin to understand what was in the mind of the audience and which is specifically social criticism, and what was in the mind of the writer. So we need to know who they were, what they were thinking, what their biases were, and how those biases affect how it was written, and thus we can dig out the truth that is embedded in the text. So we can make generalizations about the Sitz im Leben, about the life setting of the passage. We can say that the legal stuff tended to come from the temple and the court. David himself put out lots of regulations about war service, about temple service, about service on his various projects, about taxes, all that kind of stuff. Equally, the temple, whether it was through Moses or through other prophetic voices, set up all sorts of laws around how you would slaughter your sacrifice and when you would do it and all that kind of stuff. Wisdom tended to come from the court of the king, the bureaucracy of the land, and just as the Chinese tended to be very into Confucian philosophy and poetry, wisdom was the staple of the bureaucrats of the Hebraic court. Psalms in their current form came from the Second Temple. It was the hymnal of the Second Temple, although the Psalms themselves came from all sorts of people. So there are Psalms there that have David's name on them. There are Psalms from singing groups such as the Sons of Korah, from Asaph, and other people. The prophetic came from prophets, and generally the prophets were operating in a context of apostasy. Either apostasy rampant, apostasy judged, so the people were under the thumb of God trying to bring them back to them, or apostasy forgiven, and so God was blessing the people and restoring them. And the prophet's role was generally about calling the people back to God. Even the historical works have a definite prophetic voice. A large part of the historical works are about teaching the people how they are to live and the attitudes they are to have to be a people that God will love and will be pleased with. Apocalyptic, on the other hand, is very different. Prophetic is more like a spoken or written word. It's more like what you see on Sunday by Sunday with the minister getting up and preaching. It's straight voice, persuading, talking, all that kind of stuff. Apocalyptic is more like Bollywood, okay? It is big visions. It is incredible beasts. It is angels. It is explosions. It's all that kind of stuff. It's a very visual medium. And its Sitz and Leben tends to come from exile and post-exile and that of oppression. Epistles tend to be from a senior leader in the church, even the planter of a church, to a church. Sometimes they go to people, but they tend to go to churches, and they're about addressing specific issues in the life of that person or the life of that church. And they became valuable beyond that situation and got passed around as something to encourage and help churches and people to live. And that is how they flowed into canon. So all the New Testament was written in communities, different communities. So Matthew and the Petrine stuff came from the Hebraic church and eventually the Roman church, and they tend to be very interested in trying to figure out how to fit this new Christian stuff into the Jewish stuff they know and they understand. So there's lots of stuff about law. There's lots of stuff about correct living. There's lots of stuff about that kind of ethos. Luke, Acts, and Paul tend to be around the original Gentile church, A lot of that church was founded by Paul, and Luke Acts, according to Acts, shows Luke to be a co-worker with Paul. And you have the talk not so much about how to fit Christianity into Judaism, but rather about how Christianity is a new way of living that is beyond the bondages and the chains of Judaism, and how to live in that new freedom. The Johannine stuff comes from a different community to Paul, but also its context is the Gentile church, and that context is more around oppression, Greek influences, and specifically Gnosticism, which is a whole other course of study. So basically you had this culture from outside the church which was subverting the Christian message, and John's community was very much into trying to deal with those situations. So how do you figure out what the Sitz and Leben is of the passage? Firstly, some texts are very good and they'll actually state the Sitz and Leben of the text. If you have that, then a little bit of thinking, a little bit of study, and you are ready to go. In some texts, the Sitz can be inferred. So if the prophet is ranting to the Jews about the fact that the poor are going hungry, the orphans are being neglected, the widows are being abused, then you can pretty much see that in the Sitz and Leben, then the people are misbehaving and not having any charity for the poor among them. And some texts, you can infer the Sitz and Leben from your knowledge. So if it is a legal passage that is talking about levies to do work for Solomon, you can pretty much say that it's coming from a bureaucratic viewpoint. Okay? The other thing you can do is you can also do some study in various commentaries. They will generally give you an outline of what the life setting is of the passage, and you can use that to give you some understanding. So it's important to realize that almost all the Bible is written to and for the covenant community. It is one of the bases of authority of the Bible in our lives. Over and over again in the Old Testament, you will find terms like, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. The Exodus was the event that created the Old Testament covenant, and the basis of that covenant was what God had done to and for the people of that time. And for that reason, the people of God were under God's authority. It's also one basis of shared understanding. Have you ever noticed how the people outside church are totally different? Church shares the new covenant, and it shares a specific understanding that is unique to that church of that covenant. And other people don't see it in the same way, and it becomes a basis of shared understanding. So to recap, our take home is the Bible has a very long history. It has many contexts, and we need to understand the context of the specific passage to understand it. It has many viewpoints. Different viewpoints belong to different Sitz and Lebens. Different viewpoints belong to different writers. It has many writers and many types of material. It is by understanding these differences that we begin to understand the text. Thank you. I hope you have found this useful, and I hope you find the written material that is available on the blog to be useful to extend your understanding of specifically Sitz and Leben, and some questions also there to help you think and reflect on some of these topics.